All right, let's talk about methanol poisoning. This is one of those diagnoses where every single minute matters, and where just having it on your radar can be the difference between a patient walking out and a patient going blind. To really understand the stakes, let's start with a real-world case. It's a scenario that could easily walk into any of our EDs, especially when a patient's just come back from a trip overseas. So this is exactly what happened in Laos. A group of tourists, including two teenagers from Melbourne, drank some contaminated local spirits. And then nothing. For about 12 to 24 hours, there's this deceptive, silent period where they probably felt okay. But then it hits. The classic catastrophic symptoms. It's just a brutal reminder of how methanol works. It's all about that delayed toxicity.
So how does a simple alcohol, something often just used as a cheap substitute for ethanol, turn so deadly? Well, the answer isn't in the chemical itself, but in what our own bodies do to it.
Yeah, see, it's a huge misconception that methanol is the main problem. It's not. The real issue starts when your own enzymes, specifically alcohol dehydrogenase, get to work. They convert methanol into formaldehyde, and then into the true villain of the story, formic acid. Our bodies are terrible at getting rid of formic acid, and that's the whole problem. It just builds and builds and builds. If you only remember one thing from this whole talk, make it this. Formic acid has this specific, nasty attraction to the cells in our retina and our optic nerve. That's what causes the classic and so often irreversible blindness that we see with this poisoning. Picking this up early is a massive challenge in the emergency department, mainly because the first signs are so misleading. You absolutely have to have a high index of suspicion. So the patient's journey kind of goes through these 4 phases. At first, they just look drunk. Maybe a bit of tummy upset. Then you hit that incredibly dangerous latent period, where they might even say they're feeling better, but they're not. This is our window. This is the time to act, because what comes next is that catastrophic dive into metabolic acidosis and visual loss. Okay, so we're suspicious. How do we actually confirm what's going on? Because, let's be real, we need answers long before a specific methanol level is going to come back from the lab. Right. Before you get that final confirmation, there are 2 key calculations you can make from their very first VBG and UEC that will point you straight in the right direction. These are your most important early clues. Now, the timing here is absolutely critical. The osmolar gap goes up early. It reflects the parent alcohol, the methanol. But the anion gap, that widens later as that methanol gets metabolized down to formic acid. So if you see an elevated osmolar gap, but the anion gap is still normal, that's your signal. That's your chance to get ahead of this thing before it really takes hold. And that brings us to the key differentials, right? A high osmolar and anion gap should make you think of toxic alcohols. The way to tell them apart is by looking at the end organ damage. It's simple. Methanol makes you blind. Ethylene glycol that's antifreeze, it hammers the kidneys. And isopropanol, or rubbing alcohol, is the odd one out. It causes ketosis, but not that severe acidosis. Okay, let's get to the most important part. You have a presumptive diagnosis. The clock is absolutely ticking. Every minute from here on out could be the difference between a full recovery and permanent damage. The entire goal here is to stop that metabolic pathway we talked about. We need to block alcohol dehydrogenase, jam a wrench in the enzymatic works to stop methanol from being converted to formic acid. That buys us time for the body to just excrete the methanol harmlessly. So in the Australian context, this is a really key decision. Fomepizole is honestly the better drug. It's cleaner, easier to dose, but it's often not right there when you need it. So you have to know your hospital's protocol, and you have to be ready to start an ethanol infusion. It works exactly the same way, but it requires way more intensive monitoring. And if you're using ethanol, this is the magic number. You are aiming to keep the patient's blood ethanol level between 100 and 150 milligrams per deciliter. This means frequent, sometimes hourly levels, and you're constantly going to be tweaking that infusion. And please don't forget the cofactors. Folic acid is super important because it helps the body break down any formic acid that's already been made. And thiamine is just standard practice for any toxic alcohol ingestion to help support the cells. So the antidote is great for stopping more toxin from being made. But for the really bad poisonings, we also need a way to get rid of what's already floating around in the system. And that's where hemodialysis comes in. It is the definitive treatment. It yanks out both the methanol and the formic acid. These right here are your exam-critical, absolute, non-negotiable reasons to get the renal team on the phone immediately.
any visual symptoms at all, that's an urgent call.
When it's all said and done, the patient's long-term outcome really hinges on these three things: how fast we got the antidote in, how bad their acidosis was, and whether they had visual symptoms when they arrived. Everything we do in those first few hours directly impacts their chance of avoiding permanent blindness. So that's the ultimate takeaway, isn't it? The next time you have a patient with a wild, unexplained, high anion gap metabolic acidosis, especially if there's a travel history or the story just feels a little off, are you going to think of methanol? Because keeping that suspicion high is the first and, honestly, the most important step in saving their sight and maybe even their life. Hey, if you found this breakdown useful, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe. We're putting out more high-yield EM topics designed for right here on the ED floor. And we really want to hear from you. What are the clinical puzzles you're running into? Drop a comment below with a topic you want us to tackle next. Thanks for watching.